The winter of 1887 was the kind that carved itself into a man's memory. Whether he wanted it or not, Montana was a country that didn't just challenge. A man, it tested the marrow in his bones. For rancher Elias Harper, who had lived 36 years under these mountains, storms were simply storms. Wolves were simply wolves. And life was simply life. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he believed. On a night drowned in snow, when the wind whipped the ranch boards like they owed it money, Elias rode back from checking the south fence, lantern blurred behind sheets of falling white. His horse, Jasper, tossed his head nervously, snorting at something Elias couldn't see, and that was the first sign the world was about to tilt. By the time he reached the barn, Jasper refused to go inside, stamping and snorting like the shadows themselves were alive. Elias muttered that the horse had gone soft until he opened the barn. Duper, and the lantern flame flickered over, something he could not explain. 7 children huddled together in a tight circle, their faces red and raw from cold, their clothes soaked, their breaths trembling in the frigid air. And in the center of that circle, lying on a bed of hay, as though the barn itself had tried to cradle her, was a wounded woman. Blood darkened the front of her dress, soaking into the hay in a slow, terrible spread. Elias froze. The oldest of the boys, if he could even be called that, barely 12, sprang to his feet, shielding the others as though Elias were the danger. The younger children stared with wide, hollowed eyes, the kind of eyes that had already seen too much. For a full breath, all Elias could do was stare at them, the impossible sight, the snow swirling behind him, the warm lantern glow brushing the edges of fear and desperation inside the barn. Then instinct grabbed him by the collar. He strode in, set the lantern down, and knelt beside the woman. Her skin was as pale as the frost gathering on the rafters. Her lips parted in shallow breaths that were slipping closer to silence. The children watched him, trembling, waiting for judgment like he was some kind of frontier god about to pass it. "Who did this?" Elias asked quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. None of the children answered at first until one boy pointed toward the hills. "Beyond the ranch. Bad men," he whispered. "They hurt Mama. They said they'd come back." Elias's chest tightened. In Montana, that could mean bandits, claim jumpers, drunken travelers, or worse. Land disputes turned bloody without warning. But who would hunt a woman and 7 children through a blizzard? He pressed his hand gently against the woman's wound. She winced faintly, a good sign, at least she wasn't gone yet. He stood abruptly and reached for blankets, water, and the emergency bandages kept for injured horses. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said firmly when the children shrank back. "But if I don't stop her bleeding, she won't last the hour." The oldest nodded, once slow as though measuring the truth in Elias's face. "Help her," he whispered. Elias worked fast, the urgency clawing at his mind. He cleaned the wound as best he could, wrapped it tightly, and forced warm water between her lips. As he worked, he asked questions in a calm, steady voice, trying not to scare the children further. Their answers came in broken pieces, enough to paint a grim picture. The family had been traveling west, seeking a small plot of land their father had purchased months prior. But someone else claimed the same land, someone ruthless, well-armed and willing to remove problems permanently. The father tried to protect them, but he had not come out of the fight. The boy's voice cracked when he said that, eyes burning but refusing to let tears fall. Elias felt something shift deep inside him, a mixture of sorrow and anger, the kind that could turn a man into a storm. He asked the woman her name, but she didn't answer. Perhaps she couldn't. Her eyelids fluttered, her breathing too shallow. But Elias saw something, determination, a mother's refusal to die while her children still needed her. He finished tending the wound, then gave the children warm blankets and guided them to sit near the barn stove. He lit it quickly, the tiny flame growing into life-saving heat. The youngest, a boy no older than 5, tugged at Elias's coat. "Are you going to keep us safe?" he whispered. Elias met the child's eyes and felt something harden inside him. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "As long as you're under my roof, nobody's touching a hair on you. Hededu." The children clung to those words as though they were the only warmth in the room. Elias checked outside again, scanning the white horizon for any sign of riders. Nothing yet, but he knew the frontier. Men capable of attacking a traveling family rarely stopped after one attempt. He returned to the barn, sat down beside the woman, and forced his heartbeat to steady. He kept watch as the children slept in tired heaps near the stove, their faces softening into innocence that had nearly been stolen from them. Hours passed and the storm raged on. The woman stirred, opening her eyes just enough to look at Elias. Her voice was soft as snow falling. Please don't let them take my children." Elias leaned closer. "They won't," he said. "You have my word." She gave him a faint smile, one born of both gratitude and unbearable fear. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They'll burn everything until they find us." Elias had known men like that before, the kind who didn't fear God, law, or consequence. He'd crossed paths with them as a younger man, back when he drifted from place to place with no ranch, no roots, and no reason to stay anywhere. He had become a rancher because he wanted peace. But peace was not always given freely. Suddenly the barn door rattled sharply. Elias sprang to his feet, hand on his revolver. The children woke instantly, fear electrocuting the air. But it was only the wind, just the angry howl of winter battering the wood. Still, it reminded Elias danger was out there, and it knew how to wait. As dawn bled slowly across the sky, Elias made a decision that would ripple through his life and Montana forever. He would not send the family on their way. He would not hide in fear either. He would stand, he would fight if needed, and he would protect these children and their mother until the threat was gone for good. And to do that, he would need help. He saddled Jasper and prepared to ride into town for the sheriff, for supplies, for anyone willing to stand against the kind of men who hunted families for land. But before he left, he turned to the oldest boy. "You're in charge until I return," Elias told him. "Keep everyone in the barn. Don't open the door for anyone unless you hear my voice." The boy nodded, though fear flickered behind his eyes. "They'll come back," he whispered. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then they'll have to go through me." With those words, Elias rode into the storm, unaware that what awaited him would test both his courage and his soul, and that his choice to shelter one wounded woman and 7 children would ripple far beyond his ranch, shaping the destiny of families he hadn't yet met and a land not yet settled. It was the moment Montana would later remember as the beginning of a legend, and it all began in a barn under falling snow, with a promise made by lantern light. The town of Bristle Ridge was 15 miles east, but Elias rode like every second was a spark on dry grass. When he burst into the sheriff's office, snow in his beard and fire in his eyes, Sheriff Alton Hayes didn't even ask him to slow down. He simply stood, buckled on his gun belt, and listened as Elias explained the wounded woman, the 7 terrified children, and the men hunting them. Within minutes, Hayes gathered 2 trusted allies, Deacon Miller, a quiet sharpshooter with steady nerves, and Jonah Reed, a tracker who could follow footprints in a windstorm. Together they pushed their horses hard through the snow, the cold biting their faces, until the ranch finally came into view. Smoke rose near the barn, and for a moment Elias's heart stopped. But it wasn't fire. It was a small, controlled burn the children had started for warmth. Inside, the mother was awake but weak, whispering that the men who attacked them were close. And she wasn't wrong. Jonah spotted riders approaching from the north. Elias felt the air tighten. Sheriff Hayes immediately set positions, Deacon in the hayloft with a long rifle, Jonah behind the stacked lumber, and Hayes himself using the wagon as cover. Elias stayed with the children until the first gunshot shattered the world. Bullets punched through the barn walls, scattering hay like sparks. Elias shoved open the trapdoor and guided the children into the cellar, telling them to stay silent, stay hidden, stay brave. Then he grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. The attackers were ruthless, shouting demands to surrender the family. Their leader, a scarred man with a voice like gravel, promised a quick death for anyone who resisted. Elias answered with a shot that forced the man to duck behind a tree. Deacon dropped another rider clean from horseback. Jonah moved in the snow like a ghost, firing from different angles to confuse the attackers. But soon more riders arrived, 7 total now, forming a noose around the ranch. They pushed closer with each blast of gunfire. When the barn shook under the assault, Hayes yelled for everyone to fall back inside. Elias slammed the door shut, bracing them with beams. Smoke and fear hung in the air. The wounded mother grabbed Elias's coat, pleading, "Don't let them take my children." Elias looked her in the eyes. "Not while I'm breathing." The attackers circled, shouting threats, and then let loose a barrage of fire. One bullet struck a hanging lantern, sending it crashing into the dry hay. Flames roared instantly, climbing the walls and rafters. The barn was turning into a death trap. Deacon shouted from the loft that the fire was spreading too fast. Jonah kicked open the back wall to make an escape hole. Elias rushed to the cellar, whispering for the children to come out one by one. Snow hit their faces as they crawled into the storm. The mother was next. Elias carried her through the smoke, shielding her from falling embers. A bullet hissed past him, grazing his shoulder. He didn't slow. Behind them, the barn crackled and groaned as beams collapsed. The attackers charged, thinking their enemies were trapped. But Elias, Hayes, Deacon, and Jonah met them head-on in the open snow, fighting with the last of their strength. Shots echoed against the mountains. One attacker fell, then another. The scarred leader turned to flee, but Deacon fired a single perfect shot that sent him face first into the snow. Silence spread slowly as the smoke thinned. The barn was gone, but the family was safe. The children clung to one another, shivering yet alive. The mother cried softly, overwhelmed by relief and grief. Elias knelt beside her as she whispered, "You saved us." He shook his head gently. "We saved each other." Over the next weeks, the story traveled far beyond Elias Harper's ranch. People whispered about the man who defied outlaws, about the sheriff who stood by him, about a burning barn and a group of children saved from death. The story inspired ranchers to protect one another, strengthened laws, and warned land thieves that Montana would not bow to violence. The woman healed slowly. The children found warmth and food and safety under Elias's roof. And somewhere during those long days, Elias realized that the silence in his home, the silence he had lived with for years, was now filled with laughter, footsteps, and life. His choice that night had changed the fate of 8 strangers, and his own.